My family has always loved to go on a lot of hikes. Now that my siblings and I are a little older, we don't go as often, but every now and then, we still get a fun family hike on a weekend. This particular Saturday, we had gone out as a family to hike this smaller mountain trail. The trail would take us to a nice view of a little waterfall and river area. The hike was great, and at the top, we stopped to eat lunch, having some sandwiches and other items that we had packed. We spent some time swimming in the cool river. Then, as evening approached, we began to make our way back down the mountain to the parking lot area. As we got close to the end of our hike, our dad abruptly stopped us and pointed down the mountain. From where we were on the trail, even though it was still a good 10-minute walk down, we could see the parking lot from our vantage point. At the time, our car was the only one in the parking lot. In the distance, it was clear to see someone was circling around the car. We stopped walking down the trail and just watched as they looked through all the windows of the car and then pulled on all the doors to see if they were unlocked. Finally, we watched in horror as the person climbed into the bed of the truck, pulling the top cover out as well, concealing themselves in the bed of our truck. This seemed to really make my dad angry as he called 911, and then we quickly descended the rest of the trail. As we got close to the bottom, but still a good distance from our car, my dad began yelling to get the attention of whoever was in the back of our truck. My dad yelled some profanities and said to get out of our truck and leave. The person hopped out of the back bed of our truck. We were close enough to see now that it was a man. He walked around our truck one last time, slashing all 4 tires, and then slowly walked away. He began to just wander around the parking lot area, disappearing in the trees sometimes, and then would come back out. We couldn't leave because he had slashed all the tires. We just tried to stay as far away from him as possible, staying at the other edge of the large parking lot across from wherever he was. The cops eventually showed up and detained the guy. We found out that the guy had been doing antics like this before in different spots around the area. Other hikers' cars had been messed with and tires slashed. It was a scary end to our hike, but it felt good to know that the guy had been caught and wouldn't harm any other hikers or their cars. It was a crisp autumn night when I decided to go for a hike. I needed to clear my mind, and being out in nature always helped. It was a fairly easy hike that I had chosen to do, just a quick evening hike. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and started up the path. The trail was narrow but well marked. As I walked, I noticed a few people coming down, but there were no others on the path going up. An hour or so into the hike, I heard someone behind me. It was a bit unusual because the trail was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, but I was alone. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was someone who started later or took a different route. I quickened my pace a little, hoping to stay ahead of whoever it was. I glanced back occasionally and saw no one, yet the sound of footsteps followed me steadily. I tried to focus on the beauty of the hike, hoping that whoever was back there would turn off on another path. After another mile, I took a short break by a small stream. I sat on a rock, drank some water, and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped. I felt a brief relief, but was still uneasy. I told myself it was probably just a coincidence, maybe someone on the trail who had their pace slowed down. I continued on as the sun was getting lower, and shadows lengthened across the path. The feeling of being followed returned though. I'd hear footsteps, then silence. I would turn around and see nothing but trees and rocks. I could hear the footsteps clearly now, almost as if they were matching my pace. I picked up my speed, hoping to reach the summit soon. I reached a viewpoint where the trail widened a bit. I decided to stop and look over the valley below. I needed a break and hoped that whoever was following me might have stayed back. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing there. I thought I saw a shadow move among the trees, but it could have been my imagination. The sun was setting, and I knew I had to make it back before dark. I started down the trail, moving faster than before. The footsteps had returned, closer now. I was terrified, and tried not to look back, afraid of what I might see. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure ahead of me on the path. It was a man, dressed in hiking gear. I called out to him, hoping that he was a fellow hiker who might have some information or could help. He didn't respond, just stood there, facing away from me. I approached cautiously, calling out again. The figure didn't move. When I was close enough to see his face, he turned around slowly. His expression was blank, and he didn't say a word. His eyes seemed distant, as if he wasn't really seeing me. I took a step back, really freaking out at this point. I decided to take another path that led off the main trail, hoping to avoid any further confrontation. I went faster, hearing the footsteps still behind me, but never quite seeing anyone. When I finally reached the parking lot, I looked back up the trail, but there was nobody in sight. I checked my car quickly and drove off as fast as I could. Later, I told a few friends about what happened, but they mostly shrugged it off as my imagination. Every time I think about that day, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me the whole time. The memory of those footsteps, always just behind me, still haunts me. Last summer, I decided to take a break from my busy life and go hiking in the woods near my town. I usually hiked alone, but this time I brought my two dogs, Max and Bella. They're both friendly and love the outdoors, so I figured they'd enjoy the hike as much as I would. I parked at the trailhead and set off on the main path. Max and Bella were trotting ahead and sniffing just about everything in sight. After a while, the trail began to climb steeply. I was sweating and breathing hard, but Max and Bella seemed to be handling it just fine. Then I heard someone behind us. I looked back and saw a man who was wearing a dark jacket and seemed to be hiking at a slower pace, but he was gaining on us. I had a strange feeling about it. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about him made me uneasy. He gave me a half-hearted wave and a forced smile. I forced a smile back and then quickened my pace. Max and Bella were still leading the way, but I hoped that if we kept moving, he'd just pass us and be on his way. The man did not pass us. He kept his distance, but stayed close enough to remain in sight. I kept an eye on him, trying not to worry. Max and Bella were well behaved, but I still felt nervous with somebody lingering behind us. I decided to take a break by a small creek that ran alongside the trail, hoping that would give the man a chance to move ahead. I sat down on a large rock and let Max and Bella drink from the creek. The man stopped a short distance away, just out of earshot. He watched us while pretending to look at the scenery. I could see him fiddling with something in his backpack, but couldn't make out what it was. After a few minutes, he approached us, saying, "Nice dogs you have there." His voice was too smooth, and his eyes didn't match the friendliness in his tone. I tried to be polite, but kept my answers short. He asked if I'd been to the trail before, and I said yes. He then started talking about other trails in the area, but his suggestions seemed random and out of place. I felt like he was trying to keep the conversation going for some reason. My instincts were telling me to leave, so I quickly stood up and started walking again, hoping that he'd take the hint. As we walked past where the man was sitting on the rock, both my dogs growled softly as we went by. This was shocking to me, as they never growled at anyone, and it kind of certified my distrust in the guy. He followed us up the trail, keeping his distance but never quite falling behind. I could hear his footsteps on the gravel trail behind me. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was on a well-traveled path and there were usually other people around. Soon the man got closer. He then asked if we were heading to a specific spot on the trail. I told him we were just out for a casual hike and didn't have a destination. He seemed to accept that but continued to follow us, asking more questions about where I was from and how often I hiked. As the afternoon wore on, the trail became less populated. The man moved back behind me. I passed a few people who greeted me here and there, but the man did not interact with them. He kept his distance, but I could sense that he was always nearby. The woods were getting quieter, and it was getting late. I knew I needed to start heading back before it got dark. I decided to cut the hike short and head back to the trailhead. I hoped the man would eventually turn around and go in a different direction. Max and Bella seemed to sense my anxiety and stayed close by my side for the rest of the hike. Finally, I reached a more populated section of the trail, and the man did not follow us past this point. I felt relieved, though I didn't relax until I was back in the parking lot. When I did, I looked around, but the man was nowhere to be seen. I drove home, feeling grateful that nothing more serious had happened. To this day, I can't forget how unsettling that encounter was. I still hike, but I'm more cautious now. I always try to stay in a well-traveled area and pay close attention to anyone who seems out of place. Max and Bella are still my trusty companions, and their presence always makes me feel safer. I was doing an internship many years ago and staying in the basement of a friend's house. The house was located far from town, in a mostly wooded area. Behind the house, about 50 feet away, was a mile-long path through the woods. I would walk the path on nice days and enjoy the serenity of it. One night, over dinner, I mentioned to my hosts that I had seen what appeared to be a house in good condition about half a mile away. It was a setback from the path on the opposite side, with no obvious access to any local roads. I didn't trespass at all. I would never stray from the trail to check out the house. I could just see the house hidden in the woods from my viewpoints on the trail. When I asked about the house, the only information the people I was staying with gave me was, "Oh, that's our neighbor. He's a hermit and hardly ever comes out. Nice guy, but best to leave him alone." That's all they said about it, so I figured, yeah, no problem. All I would do is walk on the mile path and not stray away from it. A few days later, I was on the path, and as I neared the section where the hermit lived, something caught my eye. I saw movement in the woods by the hermit's house, so I turned my head and saw a man completely dressed in an all-white outfit. His pants, shirt, and hat were all white. My first thought was that he kind of looked like Colonel Sanders. The man was slowly walking through what looked like a garden in his yard. He stopped and looked right at me, so I gave a friendly smile and short wave and kept going. On my return walk home, he was nowhere to be seen. The next week, I went out for another walk on the trail. This time, as I got closer to the same section near the house in the woods, I felt like I was being watched. It was more intense than I'd ever had that feeling before, so I slowed and listened very carefully, trying to casually glance around the woods. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. About 20 feet ahead of me, perched on top of a thin dead tree trunk, just below eye level, was a dirty and mutilated doll's head. It might not sound like much, but it was freaky. I looked at it, made an obvious nodding gesture, deliberately turned around, and went the other way back home. I never took another walk through that woods trail for the rest of the time that I stayed at that house for my internship. I was just that freaked out by the hermit and his house in the woods. Not too long ago, I took the scariest hike of my life. It was supposed to be a simple walk in the mountains and a chance to escape. My friends and I had been planning this trip for weeks, and despite the rain in the forecast, we were excited. We started on the trail around noon. The sky was overcast, but it wasn't cold. The trail we chose was a well-trafficked path in the foothills, known for its beautiful views and relatively easy terrain. The plan was to go up a few miles, take a break at a scenic overlook, and then head back before dark. We had been hiking for about an hour, and I decided to take a short break on a rock beside the trail. My friends continued ahead, planning to wait for me at the overlook. As I sat there catching my breath and drinking some water, I heard something that was strange. It was a soft rustling sound not too far away. I looked around, expecting to see a deer or maybe a small animal, but instead, I saw something far worse. There, emerging from the bushes about 100 feet away, was a mountain lion. The mountain lion didn't seem to notice me right away. It was slowly moving along the trail, its head low, sniffing the air. I knew mountain lions were dangerous and had read many stories of people seeing them and even being attacked by them, but I never thought that I'd encounter one. I slowly reached for my phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The mountain lion was getting closer, its gaze now focused in my direction. I knew that shouting could provoke it, and running away would likely trigger its chase instinct, so I just sat there, frozen. I then heard a loud noise from the trail below. It sounded like a group of people talking and laughing. It was a group of cyclists riding up the trail. They were a large group, probably a dozen or so, and they were making quite a bit of noise as they rode. The mountain lion seemed startled by the sound. It paused, looking in the direction of the noise. I watched, barely able to breathe, as the lion's attention shifted. The cyclists were getting closer, and as they did, they were shouting to each other and ringing their bells. The noise and commotion seemed to unsettle the mountain lion. It turned and looked back at me briefly, and then, as the cyclists approached, it bolted into the underbrush. The cyclists, now riding past me, noticed me sitting on the rock. They slowed down, some asking if I was okay. I nodded and told them what had happened. They were all shocked, but relieved to hear that I was unharmed. They said they had seen the lion on the trail, so they started making all the noise to try to scare it away, but didn't realize it was so close to me. I quickly joined my friends at the overlook and told them about the entire encounter. They assured me that it was rare to encounter mountain lions, but it's always a good idea to be aware of your surroundings and make noise when hiking to avoid such encounters. As we made our way back to the trailhead, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The noise of the cyclists had saved me, and I thought that if I ever saw a mountain lion, I wasn't supposed to make noise. If they hadn't shown up when they did, the situation could have been much worse. That moment on the hiking trail was by far the closest I had ever been to dying, and the image of a mountain lion ripping through me scares me enough to stay away from hiking now.